Imagine a 3-year-old child who calmly tells you the name of the person he once was, the town he lived in, how he died, and every detail checks out. Now imagine not one such case, but thousands. That's exactly what Dr. Ian Stevenson, a respected psychiatrist and professor at the University of Virginia, spent his life investigating. He didn't take stories at face value. He traveled across the world, interviewed families, examined medical records, and gathered hard evidence. What he found was staggering, case after case suggesting that the soul survives death and carries memory into the next life. But you won't hear about him in most scientific journals or conferences. Why? Because his discoveries challenge the very foundation of materialist science. In this video, we'll uncover how Dr. Stevenson quietly built the most compelling case for reincarnation ever documented, and why the scientific world has chosen silence over acceptance. Dr. Ian Stevenson was not a mystic. He wasn't a spiritualist, a medium, or a fringe theorist chasing metaphysical fantasies. He was a medical doctor, a psychiatrist, and the chair of the Department of Psychiatry at the University of Virginia. Born in 1918 in Montreal, Canada, Stevenson earned a reputation early in his career as a careful, disciplined thinker. He published extensively on psychosomatic medicine and even won awards for his work in academic psychiatry. But beneath his conventional scientific accomplishments was a deep curiosity about questions most scientists were too cautious or too afraid to ask. In the 1950s and 60s, Stevenson began reading case reports about young children, mostly in Asia, who seemed to recall lives they could not have possibly lived. These weren't vague memories or dreams. They included names, places, events, and even details surrounding their deaths. In many cases, the children insisted on returning to their former homes, recognized relatives from their previous families, and behaved in ways completely uncharacteristic for their current upbringing. To any casual observer, it might have seemed like fantasy or coincidence. But to Stevenson, it presented an opportunity to test one of the most profound questions in human existence. Does consciousness survive death? Rather than speculating, he decided to investigate. Stevenson began traveling to countries where such reports were more common: India, Sri Lanka, Lebanon, Burma, now Myanmar, Turkey. He meticulously gathered data, often arriving at the scene within days or weeks of the initial report. He interviewed not only the children and their current families, but also, when possible, the people identified as their previous relatives. He cross-referenced testimony, sought out death certificates, and verified physical locations described by the children. If a child said he was stabbed in a past life, Stevenson examined medical records to confirm whether a person with that name and wound had really died. He approached each case like a detective, determined to find inconsistencies or alternate explanations. And yet, the more he searched, the more he found patterns he couldn't ignore. By 1966, Stevenson published his first major work, 20 Cases Suggestive of Reincarnation. The title was cautious, deliberately worded to avoid overstating the findings. But within its pages were case after case where normal explanations, fraud, coaching, coincidence, simply didn't hold up. Children described prior homes they had never visited, recognized people they had never met, and in some cases bore birthmarks that matched fatal injuries suffered by the deceased individuals they claimed to have been. What made Stevenson's work so powerful wasn't just the strange nature of the cases, it was his method. He insisted on first-hand investigation, multilingual documentation, and scientific rigor. He didn't rely on hypnosis or anecdotal accounts told decades later. He wanted real-time reports, verified by multiple sources. His background in medicine gave him the tools to evaluate physical evidence, while his scientific mindset demanded that he pursue truth, not belief. Stevenson never claimed to have proven reincarnation. In fact, he repeatedly stated that such a conclusion would go beyond the data. Instead, he presented his cases as suggestive, meaning they raised serious questions that could not be easily dismissed. He didn't ask people to believe in reincarnation. He asked them to look at the evidence and think. For Stevenson, the motivation wasn't sensationalism. It was the desire to understand what lies beyond the boundaries of birth and death. He believed that if even one of these cases was genuine, then our understanding of consciousness, identity, and the human soul would need to change. And so, he kept searching, kept documenting, and kept publishing. Over the course of his life, he compiled more than 2,500 cases across 40 years of research. Today, Ian Stevenson stands as one of the few scientists who dared to approach the mystery of the soul with both skepticism and sincerity. He opened a door that materialist science refuses to enter, not because the evidence isn't there, but because its implications are too great. Among the thousands of cases Dr. Ian Stevenson investigated, certain ones stood out, not only for their emotional intensity, but for the overwhelming volume of verifiable detail they contained. These were the cases in which very young children, often between the ages of 2 and 5, spontaneously began speaking about a life that wasn't theirs. They recalled names of people they had never met, described houses they had never seen, and referred to professions or events far beyond their current experience. In many of these cases, Stevenson was able to verify that a deceased individual matching the child's descriptions had, in fact, lived and died in the precise way the child described. One of the most famous cases was that of a boy named Ravi Shankar in India. At the age of 3, Ravi began insisting that he had once been a teacher named Suresh Verma, who had been shot in the chest in a neighboring town. He provided his previous home address, the names of his wife and children, and the color of the car he drove. When his current parents took him to that town, the family of the deceased teacher confirmed every detail. Even more remarkably, Ravi had an unusual birthmark on his chest, exactly where the real Suresh Verma had received the fatal bullet wound. Stevenson obtained the autopsy report of Verma's death, and the wound location matched the birthmark perfectly. This wasn't an isolated incident. In many of his documented cases, Stevenson found that children who recalled past lives also bore birthmarks or physical deformities that mirrored the fatal injuries of the person they claimed to have been. These marks weren't vague. They were often oddly shaped, unusually large, or located in areas not typical for birthmarks. In one case, a child in Turkey recalled being a man who was killed with a shotgun blast to the face. The boy was born with severe facial deformities consistent with such an injury. Stevenson reviewed hospital records and matched the child's deformities to the documented trauma suffered by the deceased man. Another extraordinary case was that of Swarnlata Mishra, a girl in India who, at the age of 4, began speaking of a previous life as a woman named Bia Pathak from a town several hundred miles away. She described that life in great detail, including her previous home's layout, her family's daily routines, and even a hidden stash of money. When the real Pathak family was found and visited, Swarnlata instantly recognized them, called them by name, and performed songs and dances that only Bia had known. Bia's family, stunned by the accuracy, confirmed more than 20 specific facts that only their deceased relative could have known. There had been no prior contact between the two families. Stevenson's strength was not just in collecting stories, but in documenting the physical and psychological evidence that accompanied them. He was especially drawn to cases where there was a closure, that is, when both the child's current family and the previous family were identified, and all verifiable details aligned. He published dozens of such cases with supporting photographs, autopsy reports, and eyewitness testimonies. What made these cases so powerful was that they followed consistent patterns across cultures, languages, and religions. Children often remembered dying violently or suddenly in their previous lives. Their stories tended to fade after the age of 6 or 7. They sometimes exhibited phobias or personality traits that made sense only in the context of their past life identity. Some would refuse to use the name given by their current parents and insisted on being called by the name of their previous incarnation. Far from accepting these stories at face value, Stevenson actively looked for explanations, such as cryptomnesia, unconscious memory, suggestion, or fabrication. But in dozens of the strongest cases, he found no plausible normal explanation. He concluded that the reincarnation hypothesis best fit the facts, not because he wanted it to be true, but because the data pointed that way. These children didn't just speak of a life before birth. Their words, memories, and physical bodies seemed to carry echoes of a person who had died, someone they had never met, but somehow once were. What made Dr. Ian Stevenson so unique in the world of reincarnation research wasn't just the content of his findings, it was the way he investigated them. Unlike those drawn to the mystical or metaphysical aspects of past lives, Stevenson approached the subject as a scientist first. He was deeply committed to objectivity and was acutely aware of the skepticism surrounding the topic. For that reason, he worked with relentless discipline, building a methodology that would stand up to scrutiny even from the harshest critics. From the beginning, Stevenson set out to eliminate alternative explanations. He believed that if reincarnation were to be taken seriously by the scientific community, the evidence needed to be gathered with the same rigor expected in any medical or psychological investigation. He did not rely on hypnosis, dreams, or anecdotal hearsay. Instead, he focused almost exclusively on spontaneous past life memories in children, particularly those who began speaking about their previous life before the age of 5. When outside influence and fantasy were less likely to cloud the experience. Each case followed a structured protocol. When he received reports of a child claiming past life memories, Stevenson traveled to the location personally or sent a trained field investigator. He would record the child's statements before any contact was made with the alleged previous family. This was crucial. It allowed him to determine whether the child had access to any information that could have been learned through normal means, such as media, neighbors, or family gossip. He interviewed multiple witnesses from both families, recorded inconsistencies, and tracked whether the child's claims matched the known facts of the deceased person's life. In cultures where multiple languages were spoken, Stevenson worked through professional translators to avoid miscommunication. He often used photographic evidence and, in cases involving physical marks or deformities, sought out medical records or autopsy reports. Importantly, Stevenson was not looking to confirm his own bias. In fact, he often challenged his own findings, actively searching for flaws in the data. If a case had too many unverifiable elements, he discarded it. Only those with corroborated details and clear documentation made it into his published work. He was particularly cautious of cases where the child or their family had prior contact with the other family or where leading questions might have influenced the testimony. One of the tools Stevenson used was a detailed questionnaire developed to assess the credibility and strength of a case. This form included more than 200 questions designed to test the internal consistency of the child's memories, the reactions of both families, and the timeline of events. He then rated the case on a scale of evidentiary strength, from weak to strong. Only the most compelling cases, those with numerous verified details and no clear alternative explanation, were published in his books and academic papers. Stevenson also compiled control groups, children who did not claim past life memories, to compare behavioral traits, phobias, and developmental differences. He noted that children with past life recall often had distinctive behaviors, sometimes including adult-like speech, unexplained fears linked to the manner of death, and emotional attachments to places or people they had never encountered in their current lives. In presenting his findings, Stevenson was extremely cautious in his language. He deliberately used terms like cases suggestive of reincarnation, rather than claiming absolute proof. He believed that it was not the role of science to provide spiritual answers, but to examine the evidence honestly and let it speak for itself. Over his career, he published more than a dozen scholarly books and over 60 peer-reviewed articles. His most famous work, 20 Cases Suggestive of Reincarnation, remains a landmark study in the field. What emerges from Stevenson's research is not a set of beliefs, but a body of data, precise, detailed, and unsettling in its implications. He knew the idea of reincarnation would face resistance in the scientific world, but he hoped that by maintaining the highest possible standards, his work would at least force an open-minded consideration. In the end, Stevenson wasn't asking anyone to believe, he was asking them to look. Despite the extraordinary care with which Dr. Ian Stevenson conducted his research, the scientific community largely ignored, dismissed, or quietly distanced itself from his work. It wasn't because his methods lacked discipline. In fact, many who read his work acknowledged the depth, the precision, and the integrity of his investigations. The problem was not in the science. It was in what the science implied. At the core of modern science lies a philosophical framework known as materialism, the belief that everything, including consciousness, can be explained by physical processes. According to this model, the mind is a product of the brain, and when the brain dies, so does the self. Reincarnation, by contrast, suggests that consciousness exists independently of the body and can survive physical death. This idea directly challenges the foundation on which most mainstream science and medicine rest. Stevenson never attacked this worldview outright. He didn't preach or proselytize, but by quietly presenting hundreds of cases that pointed to the survival of memory, personality, and physical traits across lifetimes, he made a subtle but undeniable challenge. And for many in the academic world, that was enough to make him untouchable. Fear played a significant role in the silence surrounding Stevenson's work. Scientists, like anyone else, have careers to protect. To publicly support the idea of reincarnation, or even to express serious interest, was, and still is, seen as professional suicide in many circles. Funding could be jeopardized. Tenure might be questioned. Invitations to conferences might dry up. As a result, many scientists who were privately fascinated by Stevenson's research avoided any public association with it. Academic journals were no more welcoming. Although Stevenson did manage to publish some articles in peer-reviewed publications, many top journals refused to consider his submissions, regardless of their content. The mere subject of reincarnation rendered the material unscientific in the eyes of editors who feared ridicule or reputational damage. This kind of gatekeeping wasn't always malicious. It was often rooted in anxiety about credibility, but it had the effect of silencing legitimate research. Even within his own university, Stevenson's work was often met with discomfort. The University of Virginia tolerated his pursuits but rarely promoted them. His Division of Perceptual Studies, DOPS, though officially sanctioned, was treated more like a quiet annex than a proud center of discovery. When Stevenson died in 2007, there were no sweeping tributes from the broader scientific world, no headlines in major journals. His life's work had been conducted with brilliance, but also in near total academic isolation. Colleagues who did engage with his work were careful in their endorsements. Some praised his methodology but stopped short of agreeing with his conclusions. Others acknowledged the evidence but insisted that alternative explanations must exist, even when they couldn't name any. A few admitted that the data was suggestive but added that they were not ready to consider the implications. In many ways, Stevenson's situation revealed the limits of scientific openness. His work was not rejected because it was sloppy or irrational. It was rejected because it was too well done and too threatening. If even a fraction of his cases were genuine, the entire paradigm of human consciousness would need to be reevaluated. And that was a leap most of the scientific establishment was not prepared to take. Ironically, Stevenson himself was never combative. He remained humble, quiet, and focused until the end. He did not demand recognition. He simply continued doing the work, gathering, documenting, and publishing, hoping that one day the world would be ready to look. And while the institutions may have failed to embrace him, the legacy of his work lives on. Quietly, persistently, and in increasing numbers, people around the world continue to discover his research, and in doing so, begin to question what they once believed about life, death, and what may come after. Dr. Ian Stevenson never claimed to have proven the existence of the soul or to have irrefutably confirmed reincarnation. What he did accomplish was something perhaps even more profound. He introduced a body of evidence so compelling, so carefully documented, that it demands to be taken seriously. He didn't ask anyone to believe. He simply invited them to look. And when you look closely at the thousands of cases he gathered, a quiet but undeniable pattern begins to emerge. What Stevenson left behind is not a doctrine or belief system. It is a vast archive, over 2,500 thoroughly investigated cases from cultures all over the world. These were not vague or mystical claims, but precise, detailed recollections often tied to names, dates, family members, causes of death, and even physical wounds carried into new bodies. Taken individually, each story is remarkable. Taken together, they form a mosaic of evidence, pointing to one extraordinary possibility: that consciousness continues after death, and in some cases, returns to live again. He showed us that memory, personality, emotion, and even physical traits like birthmarks or deformities could transcend the limits of a single lifetime. And he did this not with speculation, but with interviews, medical reports, death certificates, and face-to-face investigation. In doing so, he transformed reincarnation from a matter of belief into a subject of scientific inquiry. Whether one accepts his conclusions or not, the data he left behind continues to speak. Stevenson's work has not ended with his passing. It is being carried forward by researchers such as Dr. Jim Tucker at the University of Virginia's Division of Perceptual Studies. Tucker has continued Stevenson's methods, focusing on American children who recall past lives, including some who describe events with astonishing detail that later proves to be true. Thanks to their efforts, the conversation around reincarnation is slowly beginning to shift from the fringe into the realm of serious consideration. And yet, the larger scientific community still hesitates. Why? Because to admit that the soul exists and that it may return would require the rethinking of everything we believe about identity, memory, the brain, and even the very nature of life and death. The medical model of consciousness as a mere byproduct of the brain would no longer be sufficient. Psychology, neuroscience, philosophy, all would have to change. It is easier to remain silent than to face such a radical shift. But truth does not vanish just because it is uncomfortable. Stevenson's data is still here. His books are still in print. His cases continue to be studied, tracked not only by scholars and scientists, but by people searching for meaning in their own spiritual journeys. For many, reading his work is a turning point, not because it answers every question, but because it dares to ask the ones most of us are afraid to face. In the end, Stevenson gave us more than research. He gave us permission to wonder. He opened a door that materialism had long kept closed, and he did it with humility, discipline, and courage. His legacy is not in headlines or awards, but in the quiet revolution his work continues to inspire. One reader, one skeptic, one soul at a time. Reincarnation may not yet be accepted as scientific fact, but thanks to Ian Stevenson, it can no longer be dismissed as mere fantasy. And perhaps that is where true discovery begins, not with certainty, but with the willingness to follow the evidence wherever it leads. Even if it leads us beyond this life. Do you believe in the rebirth of souls? Write in the comments. Dear friends, if you liked this video, please like it and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. See you soon.